Good day, Lasallians. Welcome again to Oral Communication, and I'm back to discuss the following topics here. So we'll talk about barriers to communication, verbal and nonverbal communication, and intercultural communication. Let's get started. So last week in class, yeah, it was 2 weeks ago. It was 2 weeks ago, we discussed how we could handle barriers in this age of virtual communication. And if you can still remember them, most of your answers speak about being flexible in creating alternatives and other ways to ensure effective communication in the absence of face-to-face interaction. We already had a short glimpse about communication barriers, and in this video recording, we'll get to know more about them. If you read your handout class, the first thing that it said was barriers in communication result in communication breakdown and misunderstanding. Now, try to recall the sharing that we had 2 weeks ago, class. Most of your classmates had kept mentioning the, the notion of being proactive than being reactive in handling barriers in communication. And I totally agree with them. We definitely need to recognize the barriers that would hinder the communication process because it will enable us to control the situation, reset conditions, and start anew. So again, class, barriers are anything that could impede, interfere, interfere, or hinder the communication process to be successful. And your barriers could be emotional barriers, use of jargon, lack of confidence, and noisy environment. We'll discuss each one of them. Emotional barriers. Our emotions class can prevent us from paying attention to others and accepting their point of views on the issue. Additionally, they can also influence how we communicate with others. So when you're having a bad day, or when you're not being in the mood, you're feeling anxious, can affect how you encode the message as the sender or decode the message as the receiver. Use of jargon. Using jargon class is one of the barriers in the realm of language. We have what we call a language barrier, right? So jargons are technical terms in a specific field. For instance, we have here coda, forte, allegro. And these are terms that would only be fully recognized by people who are into music. Or we only have the other term here, ischemic heart disease. And this would only make sense to medical students, doctors, nurses, or people in the medical field. So make sure to use words that people can relate to. Next, we have lack of confidence, and this barrier is under the psychological barrier. Lack of confidence class is definitely an inhibiting factor in communication. And most of you may have experienced this at some point in your lives. For example, you did not respond to the teacher's question because you were shy and you don't have the confidence to confess to someone whom you like, and many more. That's because you lack the confidence. That's why it's a barrier in communication or to communication. Lastly, we have here a noisy environment class. Now try to imagine when your teacher was having his or her class and your classmates were very noisy. Typically, you cannot pay attention to your teacher's discussion due to the environment. It could also be when you're reading the recent tweet of your favorite K-pop idol, but you cannot process the message because your sister has been talking to you, television is on, and the volume is high, your little brother is crying. In short, it's a noisy environment and you cannot really decode the message there as the receiver. And that's for your barriers to communication. Further, let's talk about verbal and nonverbal communication. In communication, we use verbal and nonverbal messages. First, verbal communication class, it's a type of communication in which words are utilized to convey information. We express ideas using terms that are easily understood by our listeners or by the person we are speaking with for effective and successful verbal communication. And when engaging in this form of communication class, you may want to consider the following here: appropriateness, brevity, clarity, ethics, and vividness. And we'll talk about each one of them. So appropriateness, it has something to do with the language we use depending on the given context. We use informal words when we are having a conversation with our friend, sending text messages, or calling someone on the phone. On the other hand, we use formal words when we are in a title defense or when we are in a project proposal. We also keep formality when we are writing our academic papers. Next, we have brevity. Brevity is being concise with what we want to convey. We avoid being wordy. That's why we have here less is more. For example, you say, I don't have the ability to do it. Well, there are a lot of words in that sentence, but you can just simply express that in, I can't do it. Okay, so that's brevity. And in applying brevity too, we also avoid adding unnecessary expressions like filler words, your and many more. These filler expression can distract your listeners, our listeners, from our intended message. So that's for brevity. Clarity means being clear. We may use specific words to convey our messages to, again, maintain clarity. And sometimes, class, misinterpretation happens when our listeners did not get our message correctly because of our complicated words, the use of jargons there, and sometimes the use of confusing sentence structures. Next, we have ethics. Now, ethics here echoes consideration. We are being considerate to we are being considerate and sensitive to our audience's background, their roles, their preferences, their status, their gender, and there are a lot of things. And one of the ways to practice ethical consideration in verbal communication class is by being careful with our choice of words. Lastly, we have here vividness. Vividness, it's when we use vivid words to convey our message because in this way, we are giving our listeners concrete images. Describing your message using colorful and vivid words allows your audience to connect with you. And it also makes your audience even more engaged in the communication process. So that's vividness. At this point, class, we'll talk about nonverbal communication. So nonverbal communication, class, it's when we don't use words, okay? We don't use words to transmit and represent meanings. It means that it refers to all kinds of human responses that aren't stated in words, okay? Now, our facial expression here, our tone of voice, our posture, our look, style of clothes, accessories, response to time and space, personality, and others are forms of nonverbal communication. Now, let's talk about its significance or its importance, all right? First here, nonverbal communication makes our utterances relevant and meaningful. I would like to excuse some background noise, class. So for example, when you want to apologize, saying I'm sorry is not enough for others to forgive you. Saying I'm sorry is not enough for others to forgive you. Typically, it's not what you say, class, but it's how you say it. And how you say it would reveal your sincerity toward your message. So that's for the first importance. Next here, nonverbal communication allows us to communicate without using words. And that's the beauty of using nonverbal communication. Whether it's just a simple smile, a brief tap on the shoulder, a handshake, a wink, we are communicating something. Third, it can also make our listeners engage. Now, try to imagine class a speaker who is just reading his or her entire speech in monotone, plus the only thing moving is his or her lips. Surely it will be agony. Utilizing gestures, facial expression, varying your tone and pace in delivering your speech, moving from one place to another, engage our audience to listen and even participate. Further, sometimes class, our nonverbal communication reveals our personality or it reveals what kind of speaker we are. People who are confident maintain sufficient eye contact, whereas people who look down frequently tend to be the shy ones. There are also those speakers who point fingers unconsciously, and sometimes it's interpreted as being authoritarian. Meanwhile, when a speaker uses both hands openly, he or she may be inclusive, warm, or friendly. Next, nonverbal communication also makes our presentation or speech delivery livelier in the sense that they support our message. It also helps us release our tension and nervousness class. Furthermore, it can make our delivery more dramatic. Now, try to visualize a speaker class who tells the story of Alice in Wonderland and then she's dressed as Alice or he is dressed as Mad Hatter. So that the costume or clothes there add up to the drama of the story there or of the speech delivery. Now, changing voices in every character can also add color in the speech delivery. So, in that way, you're being dramatic, or the nonverbal communication makes the delivery more dramatic. And then we also have here another example facial expression there, making the delivery more dramatic. Okay. Nonverbal communication class also allows us to connect with our listeners, with our audience. So, establishing eye contact, using friendly gesture, or by just simply smiling at them, it's already a form of connecting with our audience. Next is our gestures, our manners, facial expression, and other nonverbal messages help build up our credibility as speakers. And lastly, class, nonverbal communication, it gives life to our speech. It enables our audience to engage, to enjoy, and relate to our speech delivery. So, those are some of the important points of nonverbal communication. Moving on, we'll talk about intercultural communication. According to Ting Toomey 1999, intercultural communication is where individuals engage, negotiate, and construct meanings while bringing their diverse cultural origins. And we also have here class that for some scholars, intercultural communication pertains to communication among people from different nationalities. Now, both interpretations show that intercultural communication occurs when people draw from their cultural identity to understand values, prejudices, language, attitudes, and relationship. And moreover, class, this facet of communication, your intercultural communication, can also be seen as a bargain understanding of human experiences across diverse societies. Now, simply put, that your intercultural communication is the sending and receiving of messages across languages and cultures. Now, sometimes class intercultural communication can flow smoothly and become very interesting for a cross-cultural group, but things may not go as planned when cultural collisions disrupt communication. Okay. Furthermore, class, when you speak, uh, your speech is continuously accompanied by gestures, right? Facial expressions, and we also have other movements that add to whatever you're saying in different ways. For example, class, nodding means yes in the Indian subcontinent, Iran, most of Europe, Latin America, and North America. However, nodding indicates disagreement in other countries like uh, Greece, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Turkey, Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Albania. Furthermore, in Japanese culture class, silence is a form of communication and it's more integrated in their custom than in Western language. That is why it is essential for you class to acknowledge and understand many communication patterns in different cultures or in other cultures. Next, we have the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. Now, this structure class primarily explores how people experience cultural differences. So Bennett and Bennett 2004 identified 6 stages. So we have your denial, your defense, minimization, acceptance, adaptation, and integration. Now let's elaborate them. So stage one, denial, it is when we cannot recognize or determine cultural differences. So example here, all cities are the same. They have all tall buildings, fast food chains, and coffee shops. So you cannot or we cannot identify the cultural differences present, okay, or the present cultural differences. Stage two, we have defense. So it is when we know there are cultural differences and we are intimidated or scared by these differences. As a result, we become defensive of our culture. So example of that one class, this culture does not view life the way we do. Our culture is certainly better and their ways are better than my own. I wish I were one of them. Okay, so that's stage two. Stage three, we have minimization. It is when we know there are cultural differences, but our interpretation minimizes the apparent cultural differences. Example, once we see through the cultural differences, we really are just the same. So it minimizes the apparent cultural differences. And stage four, we have acceptance. In this stage, we appreciate and accept the significance of cultural differences, especially in how they shape behaviors and values. For example, these people and I have different values and experiences, and I can think we can learn from one another. So it's the appreciating and accepting the present cultural differences. Then we have stage five, adaptation. It's when we become open to new perspectives. So for example, to address our issue, I have to adjust my approach to consider both my own and my counterpart's background. So that's adaptation, being open to new perspectives. And we have the last stage here, integration. And in the last stage, we consider other cultures apart from our own. And that's also when we recognize how various cultures affect our perspectives and behaviors. So example, I can look at the things from the perspective of various cultures. Now let's move on, class, to the last part of our discussion in intercultural communication. Here are the different characteristics of competent intercultural communicators. So everything here is self-explanatory. So we have flexibility and the ability to tolerate high levels of uncertainty, being able to appreciate culture, although it doesn't make sense to you. We also have reflectiveness or mindfulness, being able to reflect from it, open-mindedness. We also have sensitivity. We also have adaptability, and also the ability to engage in divergent thinking or thinking creatively. And we also have system level thinking, or thinking how each one in a system or organization influences each other. And we have the last one here, which is your politeness. Here are some ways, class. Here are some ways to avoid bias. First, avoid stereotypes, avoid generalizing a certain group. We also have here challenge gender norms. So avoid using he and man to refer to a general group of people. And you may use plural pronouns to avoid this one, or you may also rewrite a sentence to avoid using pronouns. Using his slash her is also acceptable. So that's for number two. Number three is do not talk down on younger people and the elderly. Do not choose your audience. That's one way of not being biased. Then number four, being sensitive to the religious practices of others, being sensitive, being respectful to their beliefs. And then last here is to be polite at all times. Do not belittle people you perceive to be on a lower social class than you. Be respectful at all times. So those are some ways on how you can avoid biases.